This was my platoon, a band of some of them. This was a convoy. I think we're packed up getting ready to move to a new position, but you could see the 50 caliber machine gun on top of the armored Humvee. That's me right there. I had a shoulder holster with a 9mm pistol. This is inside Kuwait. As I mentioned, the further into Kuwait we got, the more destruction like this you'd see. It's an Iraqi T-62. And you could tell we're dirty. We hadn't washed our clothes or anything in weeks. This is Paul Miller. He's the communications officer. He's my buddy that we flew in first class home on that TWA. That's Paul Miller again. We're out it was raining. This was toward the end of 1990, and we're getting our rifles ready to go into Kuwait. You had to get a battle site 0. This is actually the President George Bush landing. I told you about that gathering in the desert. There he is coming through. That's George Bush Sr. Rough Rider, my dad was an RDFO in Vietnam, and sometimes he would be an FO on Rough Rider convoys. Probably a lot more dangerous than the convoys we were on, but being from Boston, being a hockey fan, it wasn't unusual for reporters to come around and interview people, and there'd be reporters from all over the country, and I thought, well, if a Boston guy comes by and asks me questions, I'm going to just take my helmet. I wanted someone to say, hey, he must be from Boston. He's a Bruins fan. But I got a Navy Achievement Medal for what I did over in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Southwest Asia Service Medal. It's the Kuwait Liberation Medal. National Defense Medal. Most second lieutenants don't get any of this stuff for years, but we all of a sudden had a couple rows of ribbons after Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which was kind of cool. I'm Jim Ambrose Jr. I'm from Norfolk, Massachusetts. Was born October 17th, 1967. I'm a veteran of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And as I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago, my dad's a Vietnam veteran, was in the Marine Corps, served in combat in Vietnam. And his best friend, Tom McNeil, was a jet pilot during the Vietnam War. So as a young kid, looked up to those guys, and just, like I said, I assumed that everybody went in and became a hero of sorts. And as I got older, I realized that wasn't true, but I was fortunate enough to get a ROTC scholarship to Holy Cross out in Worcester. It was a Marine Corps option Naval ROTC scholarship. And in return for them paying for 4 years of college, I had to serve 4 years in the Marine Corps. And at the time, it was the late 80s, when I was in ROTC and when I was in the basic school afterwards down Quantico training, everything was geared toward big conventional war against the Russians over in, I guess what we assume would have been Europe at the time. And so there was no inkling of any sort of potential for conflict in the Middle East. And so it was really a shock when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I had to literally get out a map and look where Kuwait was. Didn't know quite anything about that neck of the woods. But to back it up, I guess after Holy Cross, I went to Quantico, which is where they train you for 6 months as a Marine. You learn all about the different aspects of being a lieutenant, combat arms, logistics, support, communications, that sort of thing. And as luck would have it, I was assigned to be a motor transport officer. I went to school down at Camp Lejeune, and as a motor transport officer, you're in charge of, getting people and equipment from point A to point B. And I got assigned to Camp Pendleton out in Southern California, 1st Marine Division. And I had to report out there in, I think it was March of 1990. Drove across the country by myself with a new pickup truck I had bought. Eventually wound up renting a house with 2 other second lieutenants, Kevin Shea and Mike Gorman, 2 guys I had gone to the basic school with. And we had a great house with a view of the Pacific Ocean. Once I settled into a bit of a routine, you'd show up at the base in the morning, do some training, and you'd be done by 4:35 each day. You'd come home, and then we'd have the weekends to goof off and go to the beach, go to clubs in San Diego or Los Angeles. So life was pretty good. I was assigned to the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, which pretty crack unit. Recon is the eyes and ears of the 1st Marine Division. They generally operate 20, 30 miles out ahead of what's called the FEBA, the forward edge of the battle area. So I was working with, and I was around a lot of, hard-charging recon Marines. I had been fortunate enough to go to jump school when I was in ROTC. I learned how to jump out of planes down in Fort Benning, Georgia. So eventually I did some parachute training with these recon guys, and it was a good unit, small, tight-knit unit. But as a 2nd lieutenant, when you show up, everyone kind of looks at you funny. You have to prove yourself. There's always a bit of a gauntlet to go through when you start out as a 2nd lieutenant. You're expected to know what you're doing, and generally it takes a while before you do. You can go through all the training in the world, but Marines who've been in the fleet for a couple of years consider themselves pretty salty, and they see a 2nd lieutenant show up. They're going to test you.
So, just a question first. So, obviously your dad was a Marine, had seen heavy combat, you probably heard some stories about that growing up. When you joined the Marines, were you expecting a similar experience? Were you hoping for a similar experience?
Good question. You hope. I always wanted to say that I was a Marine. I looked up to my dad and I looked up to Tom McNeil, and they would tell stories about Vietnam, and they might as well have been Luke Skywalker talking about fighting the dark side in Star Wars. They were real life superheroes, and I grew up in Norfolk, which is a sleepy suburb of Boston, and like you could say, life was fairly dull, and there was always that calling as a young man to kind of prove yourself and go out and see the world and go test yourself. And at some point, I picked up a book my dad had read called A Rumor of War by Phil Caputo. My dad didn't talk much about Vietnam when I was a kid, and for understandable reasons, but I was very curious about it as an adolescent kid, 12, 13 years old. But this book, Rumor of War, is about a Marine lieutenant. He talked about going to officer candidate school in Quantico and then eventually serving in Vietnam. And the way he described officer candidate school, how tough the DIs were and how they'd hit you and yell at you and make you do push-ups and run up and down these hills. On a day like today with a helmet on, up and down these hills in Quantico, it was like, wow, you can make it through that. You become like a Jedi Knight. That's how I looked at it. So there was some of that. I wanted to say, yeah, I did that, and prove myself. And my dad was still is a very strong male role model for me, and to just be able to do, I didn't think I'd end up doing what he did in Vietnam. Vietnam was a gruesome war in many ways, and part of me hoped I'd never had to see that, but part of me kind of hoped that maybe I could deploy or do something, be part of history. But like I said, there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell in my mind that we were going to fight the Russians. It just seemed like we had our nukes pointed at them, they had their nukes pointed at us, and we were around just in case, But you trained, and the Marine Corps takes being prepared very seriously, so it wasn't a laissez-faire attitude. But when we got word that we were going to Saudi Arabia, it was a big shock. It came as a surprise, like I said.
So what was it like when you found out that you actually were going to see combat?
Well, like I said, we had a routine on the weekends. We'd go to the beach. We had a great house. We had friends from 29 Palms, which is about 3 hours inland in California, and they would all come to the coast to hang out with us, to go to the beach and, chase girls, go to clubs, that sort of thing. And we were on the beach, and my friend Frank Grimkowski, who was from 29 Palms, an infantry officer, said, hey, we just got alerted we have to report back to 29 Palms. They were 29 Palms is the desert, and the 7th Marines was the regiment he was part of. He said, I think something's going down. Something's happened in the Middle East. And I remember thinking, oh, geez, that sucks for you guys. I'm going to stay here at the beach. He went back to 29 Palms. That was like August 1990. Within a couple of weeks, though, the whole 1st Marine Division was mobilized. The whole base was, we found out, deploying. This was not going to be a small deployment. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. He was threatening to take over Saudi Arabia, which would have given him control of a big percentage of the world's oil. I didn't understand that then. I've thought about it and read about it since then, but it was important to prevent him from going into Saudi Arabia. So that's why the Marines generally can get the most people to a hotspot in the world the fastest. You know, the Marine Corps 1st Marine Division deployed and the 82nd Airborne deployed, but they can't bring as much equipment as the Marines. The Marines come with ships, and they're prepared to fight right off the bat and supply themselves for at least 30 days, generally a fast-moving force of a regiment size, generally.
Did you talk to your dad at all before?
Yeah, I did, and they were very upset. My parents, so August 2nd, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and within a few short weeks, we got word we were going, you know, and there was a scramble, preparation, packing up equipment, new uniforms, shots, immunizations. And my 2 roommates, they both left before me. Kevin Shea was a comm officer with 9th Marines, with the comm battalion for the 1st Marine Division. And my other roommate was a supply officer with Force Recon. And they left before me, so I was by myself. My parents came out to visit, and it was nice to see them, but it was a little bit, you know, upsetting too. I could tell they were worried about me, particularly my dad, when he talked to you, you know, half a dozen of his friends were killed, and he saw dozens and dozens of people killed in Vietnam. So that was the backdrop, so it was a little bit of a melancholy visit, and he told me, just listen to your staff NCOs, don't take any unnecessary risks, protect your Marines. You know, there's only so much you can say. You know, no one knew what was going to happen. And the mission initially was to defend Saudi Arabia. And we joked when we first got there, we were a speed bump. You know, we were a small force that they thought might get run over by Saddam. You know, we were going to fight them, obviously, but so that was the mentality at the time. It was a big scramble. It was confusing, and not knowing exactly what was going to happen. We didn't know there'd be combat. We thought, well, we could just deploy there similar to what we have in Korea and just defend Saudi Arabia. We didn't know ultimately we'd be going into Kuwait. So
tell me about the deployment.
The deployment. Interestingly enough, the battalion packed up. That was a huge effort. We were a small unit, part of the 1st Marine Division. We convoyed up to El Toro, a Marine Corps air station about a half hour north of Camp Pendleton, and the battalion loaded all its gear up on 3 C-5A Galaxies, which is a humongous plane, one of the biggest in the world. I was the junior 2nd lieutenant in the battalion, and the first two plane loads left, and I was the last officer in charge of the 3rd plane. My commanding officer said, "You're in charge, you're in the last plane, make sure these Marines get on the plane and the equipment's on the plane." I said, "Aye, aye, sir." And as luck would have it, the plane we were on took off and had to turn around and come back for mechanical problems. And this is a bit of a deviation from the whole story here, but that happened again one more time. We took off and the plane broke down, there was problems, and we were sleeping on the runway, me, a company of recon Marines, and my motor transport platoon. Eventually we flew to Delaware, Dover, Delaware, and the pilot said to me, "Hey, this plane's got a lot of problems. You're going to be here for a while." So they worked all night on the plane. We took off from Dover, Delaware. Again, turned around and landed at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm thinking, geez, I'm going to die before we even get over there, you know? They fixed the plane up again, and so we're 3 days behind the rest of my unit. I'm like, well, how am I going to know where to go when we get over there? Took off from Dover. Eventually, this time, the plane proceeded onward, flew all night over the ocean. C-5A is a huge plane. It's loaded with trucks and equipment and pallets down below. And up in the very rear of the plane, there's like a movie theater seating. I think we were facing rearward. I'm not quite sure, but it was dark and there are no windows. There's one small window. So it was a long, hot, boring flight. And we landed in Germany, Rhine-Main, Germany. Slept for 6 or 7 hours in this giant field house. A couple guys were able to do laundry. It was a big army hangar. They had like machines, like Coke machines, but you could buy cans of beer out of them. A couple guys bought some cans of beer out of these machines. And then we took off from Germany, landed in Italy somewhere. I'm going to assume it was Aviano. I'm not sure. We didn't get out of the plane. They just refueled. And then we went to Saudi Arabia. So you're talking 3 or 4 days of time, and total time in the air probably, I don't know, 20 hours. Long time. And you're in the same desert uniform, you got your gear. And another side note, before you deploy overseas, they gave us a whole bunch of shots. One of the shots they give you is called a gamma globulin shot. It's supposed to boost your immunity system. And they give it to you right in one of your butt cheeks, right? And it swells up like a tennis ball. And it's painful, you know. It boosts your immune system with a bunch of stuff that's supposed to prevent you from catching diseases in foreign countries. So you're sitting on your butt in a canvas seat, or not so comfortable a seat, for 20 hours in a plane. I remember that being a little bit of a problem. But eventually we rolled out and landed at the King Fahd International Airport in northern Saudi Arabia. It's about 4 o'clock in the morning. It was dark out. And we sat on the runway waiting to go up to the terminal area. And then the sun started coming up. It started getting real hot in the plane. Then they opened the door. It was probably 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. It was hot, real hot. And we get out of the plane and kind of walked up to a big staging area. Tons of activity going on. Hundreds, thousands of troops landing. There were Army troops, Marine troops. There were helicopters coming and going. And it was hot, you know, it was dusty. Wind was blowing. It was stifling heat, 90 to 100 degrees. But, you know, I was nervous, trying to find out where to go, what to do. There was no one there to greet me. And I just kind of put our guys in a particular area. There were some pallets of bottled water, which I had never seen or drank from before, and they had Arabic writing on them, and they handed them out to us, and they were hot, but you drank it to just be hydrated. Again, the noise, the smell, and the sound, it was big. You could tell there was just a ton of people coming in country. And there were, you know, guys driving, local guys, you know, Saudi Arabian guys driving forklifts and trucks and tractors around. They had, you know, like the headgear that a Saudi Arabian, a Muslim guy would wear, and they had like long white robe type things, and they were covered in dirt. And I said, well, I'm not in Norfolk, Mass anymore. This is a different country. And that's what guys would wear, you know, native folks over there. So they were helping unload the planes.
So you felt like you were part of something big.
It was huge, yeah, it was huge. And again, I'm the second lieutenant, just hoping that my unit hasn't forgotten about me. I don't know where they are at this point. I have pictures I'll show you of just airline plane after airline plane. Every 10 minutes someone would land and 100+ guys would get out. And like me, they'd be standing around wondering what's happened. So there were thousands of people coming in. And it's hot, you're in a uniform, it's disorienting. And you know.
At the same time, you must be feeling like, okay, like we're here.
Yeah.
Let's go.
There was a little of that. Again, the uncertainty is tough to explain, you know. Will I ever get home again? Is this my last place I'm going to see on the planet Earth? I don't know. And it was a barren, desolate area where we were. There's a giant airport. It wasn't like Logan Airport where you walk off a little causeway and get into an you get out of the plane and you stood around on the runway. Eventually, after half a day, my CO came. His name was Captain Bob Putz, and he's a neat guy. But he picked me up, and we had our trucks that came off the plane, and we just got into a convoy and drove to a camp probably 20 minutes away toward the water, a city called Al Jabail, just outside this humongous oil refinery. And the camp they set us up in was a camp originally designed for workers that would work on these oil fields. I guess they brought in a lot of foreign folks to work on these oil rigs, and they would live in these camps. And it was set up like a military base, a perfectly square mile place with Quonset hut type living facilities. They had air conditioning, showers, bathrooms. So our little unit had 2 or 3 of these, maybe 4 or 5 of those Quonset huts. I met my CO, and we kind of got our feet on the ground, and you know, it's like, okay, I made it. Now what, you know? And this was the Desert Shield portion of things. Really, the majority of the experience for me was Desert Shield, because you're there, and it's months of trying to figure out what's going to happen. We stayed in those barracks for about 3 or 4 weeks. Recon, the unit I was attached to, was assigned to get up to the border very early on. So we had recon teams in these little, they were like police stations, these old cement buildings, looked like mini castles, right on the border of Kuwait. And we set up observation posts with sandbags and everything in these buildings. So recon was involved with a kind of a mission early on. Not everyone had a mission. A lot of people would sit around and do training in the desert and try to stay tactically proficient. But early on, August 1990, it was very hot. But as the motor transport officer, once a week we were transporting Marines up to the border of Kuwait. So, and by then I was familiar with a lot of the recon team leaders and the company commanders, platoon leaders. And they brought me up onto these police posts, and I could look through spotter scopes, and you could see the Iraqis moving around in Kuwait. And I'm like, well, here I am, man. This is the cutting edge. This is the tip of the spear, as we used to say in the Marine Corps. I remember it being so hot, you could see, it was blurry images, but you could see the Iraqi guys just were living in these trenches out in the desert of Kuwait. So that became a fairly routine. We would bring Marines up with supplies to stay on the border, and we'd bring the guys that were up there back. And it was a pretty long day. It took up basically the whole day. You'd get up in the morning, you'd load up equipment. They would need food. You'd bring bullets, you know, first aid, all sorts of stuff, radios to bring up, batteries for the radios. And I was up at the border, like I said, once a week. If I didn't run up there with the convoy, my staff sergeant, Troy Weiss, would take a convoy up. But it was something to do, and I felt like I was busy while a lot of my peers were kind of waiting around. And I'd come back to that camp where we were, and they'd say, hey, what'd you see? What's going on? And so in that respect, my job was unique, and I got to get out and do stuff, see the countryside, what there was of it. There wasn't much. Camels, dead camels on the side of the road that had been hit by trucks. But on the border of Kuwait, there were a lot of people. There were Navy SEALs. I'd see civilian guys in civilian clothes driving pickup trucks, which we assumed they were CIA guys. There were British forces that would come up there. So was an interesting perspective for a young lieutenant. I got to kind of see this is where the action is. This is why we're here.
Any memorable events from Desert Shield?
Yeah, well, geez. Desert Shield went on from August of '90 through really December, Christmas of '91. I think it was early January we started bombing Kuwait, and that's when the Desert Storm kicked in. But we eventually moved out of that camp, and we kept moving further and further north to positions in the desert. And there were no more showers, no more beds, no more bathrooms. You were living for weeks and months out in the field. And unlike New England, it went from being really hot to all of a sudden being cold and uncomfortable, and it started to rain. And we didn't have any cold weather gear, so there was some cold nights and uncomfortable conditions. Again, I continued to bring troops up to the border, bring guys back. A couple of convoys. One time I got sent out to pick up some German Shepherds from another Marine unit. They wanted like mine-sniffing dogs up at the border. I remember for the first time, instead of just going north and coming south, I had to go west. And it was me and another corporal, Kenny Trottier from New Mexico. We're in a 5-ton truck, and we drove for hours through different positions, Army positions. Eventually found this Marine unit. It was part of the 2nd Marine Division. You'd think it'd be easy to find a unit with 10, 20,000 people in it, but it was like being on the ocean. I mean, we had to follow maps, stop and ask people. And we drove through a lot of different units, and I remember thinking, geez, this is huge. It looked, it was starting to look like D-Day, but instead of ships, there were tanks and trucks positioned 20, 30 miles south of the border. That was one particularly interesting mission. We continued to do convoys after the air war started, so it became dangerous, because the Iraqis made some attacks on the Marines stationed up there on those little units. But we still had to bring recon teams up and bring recon teams back. They were actually shooting at the Iraqis on a couple of occasions, so we had to bring ammunition up to them. One particular occasion, the Iraqis came across the border. Our recon Marines engaged the Iraqis, and another Marine unit, the light armored infantry, they're not quite tanks, but they're an armored vehicle with 3 wheels on each side. They engaged in a bit of a fight with these Iraqi tanks, and some Air Force A-10s came in and accidentally hit these Marines, a couple of Marines, and killed about, I don't know, half a dozen or maybe 10 Marines in a friendly fire incident. I wasn't on the border at the time, but we got woken up early in the morning because some of my Marines were, and we had to get a convoy out to go up and bring those guys back and pick up the equipment and everything that was kind of up there from that engagement. So I remember seeing the smoldering Marine light armored vehicles. And there was an Iraqi tank that was destroyed. Things were getting real at that point, and I didn't do much work at night, but you did some work at night. But soon after that, we had to put these orange V's, like a flag type thing on top of your vehicle, whatever vehicle you're in. If you see pictures of Desert Storm, you might see those V's. And that was so planes flying above you would notice that orange V, that's a friendly guy. It's kind of a rudimentary way to protect you from friendly fire incidents, but at nighttime, all those pilots could see is heat signatures, and they see these different vehicles engaging. There were a few incidents like that. I'm surprised there weren't more, but you've got thousands of guys with all that firepower at their fingertips. So
Did that stick in your mind at all?
Yeah, it did. Stuck in my mind. Each week, as things progressed, there were more and more units going closer and closer to Kuwait. And the notion that we were going to just outweight Saddam and his forces and end this thing peacefully started to fade. And they started telling us the only way we're going to get out of here is go through Kuwait. And I didn't know what that was going to mean or what that was going to look like, but I knew it was going to be potentially very dangerous. At some point, I was on a convoy, and we stopped to refuel or something at a forward refueling area, and this huge Army convoy was going by us heading north. Army, it had to be 50 to 60, 70 trucks, and they were carrying these big boxes, and someone said, "Hey, what's that? What's going on there?" And someone with some knowledge said, "Those are refrigeration units." Like refrigeration units, what do we need those for? So that's what they're planning on, 30,000 casualties in the first week or two, and that's where they're going to store the bodies of the dead Marine soldiers. And I remember thinking for a split second, geez, is that how I'm going to leave this place, in one of those green coffins? That was a memorable incident. The only other thing that I was the junior second lieutenant in the recon battalion, and you get these strange assignments as the youngest lieutenant. The battalion commander liked me because he was a Vietnam veteran, and I had talked to him about my dad in Vietnam and everything. But at some point, George Bush, the president, was coming over to have Thanksgiving dinner with us. So in typical military fashion, each unit had to send a quota group. So everybody from every unit was represented. And everyone looked down at it like, send Ambrose. So it was me and about a dozen Marines, mostly from my platoon, a couple of the recon guys, got to go to this big staging area in the desert. I have some pictures I'll show you. And we got to this area. There was Secret Service. There was all sorts of security set up. Before we could get into this area in the middle of the vast desert, we had to take the bolts out of our rifles and pistols, put the bolt in our cargo pocket of our trousers just so no one assassinates the president. It seemed ridiculous, but it was a thing. And then we got to gather around this big group, and all of a sudden 2 F-15s start flying around, and then a gaggle of helicopters comes flying over, and there were 2 or 3 of them with the presidential seal on it, I guess to make it deceptive to anybody who was trying to shoot the president down. Helicopters land, and then George Bush gets into a Humvee, comes up with Barbara Bush and some other VIPs. There were some senators, and he gave a big speech. I was from here to, the house away from the president. And I thought, oh, this is cool. I'd never seen a president before. He gave a good speech. At some point, his wife walked through the crowd, was shaking hands. She had on a desert, utility blouse, and she was a kind woman. I remember she shook some hands, and it was kind of a touching moment. I mean, it was the first time anybody had been, I heard like a nice voice or someone say something nice. But she said, I get choked up thinking about it, but she said, we're very proud of you, And that stuck with me, and I thought, geez, this is something bigger than what I had been thinking about at the time. It was a nice thing she said. Anyway, in addition to the president, there was a few senators. I really didn't know the senators, but there was a senator from Maine. Mitchell was his last name, and I had a guy in my platoon from Maine, and in a bold move as a second lieutenant, there was a colonel talking to the senator and a bunch of people, handing him food. And I said, "Excuse me, Senator Mitchell, I've got a Marine from Maine here. I'd like to say hello to you." And he hands his plate to this colonel, and the colonel looked at me like, "What are you doing?" But the senators are, much higher ranked than a colonel. And the guy took my Marine aside and talked to him and then eventually called him at home, said, I met your son, be like Senator, Kerry or somebody, making a phone call to your house. So I'm still friends with that kid, Eric Norberg from Maine, on Facebook. Good guy, but that was a cool moment. We had Thanksgiving dinner with the president.
So now you're looking ahead to Desert Storm.
Right. We didn't know it was going to be called that. At some point, so there was this obstacle belt in Kuwait that we were supposed to go through, and the thought was the U.S. troops are going to invade Kuwait, but they're going to get hung up in this minefield, and that's when the Iraqis are going to hit us with chemical weapons. And so we're all going to get attacked with nerve agents and be bogged down in this terrible minefield. And I was thinking, how the heck are we going to get through that? But they had a plan to blow through that thing like butter. Desert Storm kicked off. It was the middle of the night. Someone woke me up, said, sir, they're bombing Kuwait. And for the next 30 days, all you'd see at night, it only happened at night. They just bombed them at night. We had night vision goggles. You could look up in the sky. There were Marine Corps jets heading from south to north. I could see, we were so close enough to Kuwait, you could see Navy planes coming from the Gulf, heading left to right. They'd come in from the water and you could see them, and then they'd head back out. B-52 strikes. At some point, we were told the C-130's coming in tonight. Be prepared. It might sound like an earthquake. They're going to drop a 30,000-pound bomb on an Iraqi position. And we heard the C-130 come in and drop this blockbuster bomb on a position. Huge boom. They bombed the hell out of those guys, And they were just waiting to really, soften every target up before they brought us closer to the border. And there was a little bit of a thought, like, we're not going to have to go. They're going to bomb the hell out of them. Which they did. And again, recon being up at the border, there were some prisoners that came over. They surrendered. And we were like, how the hell did you make it through the minefield? And they said, well, the mines are right on top. We just walk around them. Ah, okay. They told us that they were out of food. They had eaten animals. They had killed animals from the Kuwaiti zoo. A lot of different memories of that time frame. It was dark and rainy and cold at that point. It was late December, early January. There was a bunch of wild dogs at some point that had come from Kuwait, headed south toward our positions. Just enough to be unusual, and someone theorized that the Iraqis stopped feeding them. They're looking for food, and they just came south to get food from the Americans. There were some Saudi Arabian special forces that were up on the border with us. And right before just after the air war started, they all left. Some of them drove themselves up there in big Mercedes-Benz and everything, and all of a sudden they just left. And it seems so strange to me, but being in the military in a foreign country is a lot different than being in a U.S. Marine Corps unit.
So was that all that bombing? Was that, I know there's the famous Highway of Death.
Right.
Did you go through that?
I did not. That was a little north of Kuwait City. So if you think of Kuwait like Massachusetts, everyone thought we were going to go in from the direct south right into Kuwait. But at the last minute, we all shifted to the west. And the 1st Marine Division was in the lower southwest corner of Kuwait. 2nd Marine Division went up a little higher, and they cut across northern Kuwait. The Army went north to Baghdad and took out some elite Iraqi units, and the 1st Marine Division took over southern Kuwait. So we made it, I wasn't part of the initial invasion force. We went in about a half day later. They blew these pathways through the minefields with these giant line charges. Just looks like a big fire hose that gets blasted out, hits the deck, and blows a big 10-foot wide pathway So we went, it was a dark, kind of rainy day, and we just convoyed slowly right through this minefield. I could see to the left and right of me these little saucer-shaped little mines right on top of the sand. But there were Marine engineers guiding us through. And we got through this obstacle belt, and all of a sudden we were in the wide open expanse of Kuwait. And you'd move forward for a few minutes, then stop and halt. You'd see some jets roll in, and they'd shoot at some Iraqi positions. The further in we went, you start to see the burnt out hulks of Iraqi tanks, armored personnel carriers. At some point we went by an airfield. I have some pictures of it, but I think it was the Al Jaber airfield, and these giant cement aircraft hangars that were designed to withstand, nuclear blasts. The American jets had dropped these, deep penetrating munitions right through the roof of them, so they all had giant holes in them. It was like something out of, a movie, really. But there was destruction everywhere. Just the results of the bombing, it just looked like a movie set, to be honest.
Does that make you feel a certain way seeing that?
In retrospect, I probably should have been more shaken up. I was young, I was excited, I was nervous about my troops and making sure we were safe. We had gas masks at certain points. Alerts came over the radio, hey, there's gas in the air, put on your gas masks. We had chemical protective suits on. So it's very uncomfortable wearing that stuff. But again, as I said, it was cold, so thank God it wasn't the heat of summer where we had these suits on, because it's very uncomfortable, and you got a rubber mask on, and but then the call would come, okay, you can take off your masks. I have pictures of, we would move forward a bit, stop. A couple times they said, okay, we want you to clear the area. We might stay here for the night. And me and a couple of Marines were going through Iraqi trenches. I had a pistol with a round in the chamber in case anyone was holding out. But you can see I'm wearing these rubber boots and the chemical protection suit, just in case there was a chemical attack. That was awkward and uncomfortable. But it just became apparent after the bombing campaign and the little dribs and drabs of intelligence that we were getting from those POW, the prisoners who surrendered, that this could be a rout. And the first day, I said, we went in, they had this 30-day plan where we could be in and out of Kuwait within 30 days. And we hoped to be here by day 1 and hoped to be here by day 2. We got halfway through the country in like day 1. And I have pictures, and I remember thousands and thousands of Iraqi troops just huddled up on the ground, surrounded by concertina wire, which is barbed wire, and 1 or 2 Americans with M16s watching them. So I said, these guys didn't want to fight. And as it turns out, they were mostly conscripts who had just been deserted. Saddam just left them there. That the way the air war worked, they cut off communications very early on, so they weren't hearing from their commanding officers. They were just basically sitting there getting the hell bombed out of them. I was amazed that many were still alive. I was close enough, and we were around them. I remember one guy, I was like from here 10, 20 feet away from these guys. A guy opened up his shirt, and he said, he had an I Love New York t-shirt on, and he was like doing this sort of stuff, like, I want to be your friend, I don't mean any harm to you guys. And so I thought, geez, well, this is working out well. Within 4 or 5 days, we were in Kuwait City, and the plan was to get out of there. It was like a miracle, really. We had the bombing totally neutralized, at least in my sector, any resistance. There wasn't, there was a few sporadic incidents where they tried to fight back, but for the most part, they were done before we even showed up in Kuwait. And thankfully, we were able to get through there without, my unit had no casualties. So but we slept in the oil fields. I think you asked me about that.
Yeah.
Surreal, you know. Going into Kuwait itself, there's a lot of airstrikes, and there was a lot of helicopters flying around. You know, the Marine Corps has a lot of helicopters. The Army has a ton of helicopters. So the sound of lots of helicopters in the air, it's this big, thick, droning, you kind of get used to that noise. And as we got closer to the oil fields, I just thought, well, it was a big drone, a loud drone. I thought it was helicopters. It turns out it was the sound of the fires burning from these wells, you know. There were hundreds of them all around. And they were shooting black smoke up into the sky. So you had flames, black smoke, and it was raining. So the rain was bringing down bits of oil in it. So the normally brownish, grayish dirt of the desert had a small sheen of oil on it. So you're driving through in a truck, a 5-ton Humvee, and for the longest period of time, my helmet and my gear had these little black dots on it from the smell of from the oil coming from the cloud. So it was just gross, you know. It was gross, and it was like something out of a horror movie, Dante's Inferno. Fire everywhere. You know, Saddam thought that was going to deter the air power from coming in and shooting up his troops. It just was a terrible, you know, environmental disaster, and it looked much worse than it was. But you know, Kuwait sits on top of a huge ton of oil, I guess, and so that the oil's burning freely up into the sky, you know. But years after I got home, that helmet, and I had this desert camouflage pattern, like cover from my flak jacket, that was just had these little black pinpricks, looked like, but it was the raindrops from the oil field, and you could smell it and still smell that kind of raw petroleum smell. Pretty distinctive smell. So that was that.
Do you like think of your family like a lot?
Yeah, of course you do. You think of your family. I had a picture in my wallet of my family, like a family picture that had been taken while I was in college or high school. I used to look at that. It seemed like I was gone a long time. It was 7 or 8 months we were over there. And I missed my family, and you know, it's easy to kind of forget what people sound like or look like. But you have a picture and you look at, you know, your family, and you don't really think about, is this when I'm going to die as a kid? I fortunately didn't see much of the combat my dad saw, but the possibility really existed that we weren't going to get home, you know. And I thought, geez, am I ever going to see my hometown again? Am I ever going to see Norfolk again? And that's in addition to, you know, seeing carnage, being away from home and not knowing what's going to happen, not being in control of your fate, it weighs on you psychologically. And some people had a tough time in the Desert Shield portion of it. A couple guys kind of, you know, had mental breakdowns. One guy, I remember, we were outside of a Marine unit, and we couldn't go into this compound. I don't know, we were picking someone up or dropping someone off, but there was a Marine who kind of went up on a mound of dirt and was shooting at people. He lost his marbles a bit. It was, you know, November, December, and I remember my dad telling me about Vietnam, saying it was like a prison, and I didn't quite know what he meant, but oddly enough, in Saudi Arabia, you could see for 100 miles all around you. It was vast, wide open desert, but I felt like I was in a prison because really, where could you go? I couldn't really go anywhere. If you did, you'd run out of gas and starve or die of thirst out in the desert. You really were at under the complete control and mercy of your commanding officers, the President of the United States, and we were there ultimately until we got rid of Saddam's troops in Kuwait. So, yeah, I was fortunate. I had good Marines. I had good leadership, and I had confidence in my training and the guys around me. We had good morale, and that's important. We had a tight platoon. I was blessed to have some good Marines. We used to play football. You'd play cards. As a lieutenant, you're supposed to maintain some kind of buffer between your troops. You're a leader. That got a little blurry in Desert Shield for me. I was not, a hardcore by the book guy. You were all sharing a common experience, and so I still think of those guys. Not a day goes by where I don't think about that experience of some aspect of the whole thing and the adventures. We made it through it's a piece of history. I didn't think about that part of it at the time, but as I've gotten older and people like yourself who have an interest in it, you realize maybe this was a little bigger than I initially thought it was.
Is there any part of it in particular that you still think of, or anything that you recall?
I think about a lot of it. At night sometimes I'm trying to sleep. I go through the whole deployment, and I've never really sat down and talked about it A to Z like I'm doing with you. But there's been a lot of talk about the Gulf War syndrome, and I've been fortunate not to have any ailments or anything from that. But at some point before we went into Kuwait, a Navy doctor came out to administer these pills that were supposed to build up your immune system to nerve agents. I forget what it was called. But he gave a speech, and the tone of his voice was such that he didn't really believe that it was. He said, I don't know how much they've tested this, but I'm supposed to tell you guys, you take one a day, and it's going to build up your immune system to any potential chemical attack or nerve agent. So people reacted. I said to myself, well, I'm sticking this in my pocket, and I'm not taking this if I don't have to. But some people reacted differently, like, I don't want to die of nerve agent. I'm going to pop this right in my mouth. One kid in my platoon, Shane Fields from Minnesota, he took it right away, gobbled it down with a canteen gulp, and within a half hour, he had swollen glands, and his eyeballs had swollen up too, all red and puffy. He had a big reaction to it. And they medevaced him somewhere to be treated for a couple of days, and he eventually came back. But that was all I needed to see. I said, I don't think this has been tested, and I told the rest of my Marines, I'm not going to force you guys to take this. It's at your discretion. I'm glad I didn't. I think that might have had something to do with it. In order to have immunization from nerve agents, you got to take some of the nerve agent, and it seemed to me it was one of those things that just got rushed out to the combat zone as a knee-jerk reaction. So it's one thing I think about.
What did the end of the deployment feel like?
Somewhat anticlimactic. We got out of Kuwait in this big rush. We were only in there for, like I said, about 6 days. And then we triumphantly convoyed through Kuwait City to throngs of people waving flags, which was pretty neat. We left Kuwait. The highway itself was bombed to smithereens, so we had to drive alongside. They made pathways on the sides of the main highway. And we headed back south toward the area where we were initially staged by the port of Al Jubail. By that time, there was this giant Marine camp set up. And it was March, April, started getting warm again. They took away all our ammunition. And we were basically just waking up, waiting for our plane rides home. They stopped serving us hot chow. One of the logistical feats of that whole deployment, Desert Shield, not so much in Desert Storm, but Desert Shield, they would get a hot meal or two out to you every day. And that Jeep from the chow tent would bring mail and stuff. It was a pretty big morale boost. You'd get, eggs and sausage in the morning, or you might get, some sort of meal at night. But when we were back in Saudi Arabia waiting to go home, they had cereal and they had this milk that had no shelf life. And at some point they ran out of white milk, so we were drinking like banana milk and Raisin Bran for breakfast, and then you'd eat 2 MREs or 1 MRE for lunch. But the theory was that the first people there were going to be the first people to leave, and so you just had to wait, and they were trying to do that in exact order. And we were back at the King Fahd International Airport, and the planes were coming in to pick people up. It wasn't quite as busy as it was when I had been there 7 months before. But I remember this big brand, looked like it was either brand new, had a brand new paint job, TWA 747 taxied up. That was our plane. And me and my buddy Paul Miller, First Lieutenant Paul Miller, were the last 2 lieutenants, last 2 guys in line from our battalion. And I'm thinking, geez, maybe there won't be seats for us. And you shuffle along, and you go up the deck, you go up the stairs. And sure enough, we get to the top of the stairs, and someone said, there's no more room in the back. And the stewardess said, we have two big seats available up here in first class, gentlemen. Why don't you make your way up here? So there we go. We get up there, me and Lieutenant Miller. I'd never been in first class before. So there we were, stretched out. A couple of VIPs and colonels giving us dirty looks, but we just stretched out. We're covered in dirt. We still had dirty uniforms on. I had a Walkman headset and listened to some Rolling Stones and stretched my legs out. So that was nice. We took off from Saudi Arabia, again landed in Italy to get fuel, didn't get out of the plane. Then we went north. We landed at Shannon, Ireland, rolled out of the clouds. And for the first time in months, I saw lush green Ireland, right? I'd never been to Ireland before, but we landed and got to get out of the plane. And there's people in regular clothes walking around the terminal, and they're looking at us, and we're still dirty we hadn't really showered or anything. We're still dirty with our uniforms. We went to a bar. I don't know how we had money, or we got beer. I had a couple of beers with Lieutenant Miller. It was fantastic. It was like surreal. Like, hey, we're out of that place. Then we flew to New York, landed in New York. A couple guys got off the plane. My colonel signed leave papers for them. And then flew to California, landed at like 3 o'clock in the morning, had a bus ride to Camp Pendleton. And we got to my unit, 1st Recon Battalion, and there was a band playing. They had a Marine band playing. There were families there picking up people. I didn't really have a girlfriend. I had no girlfriend at the time. I was by myself, but my roommates had gotten back before me, and they showed up with their girlfriends, picked me up. We drove back to that house we had up there, and I couldn't believe it. I got into my bed, it felt like heaven on earth sleeping in a bed, because I hadn't really slept on a mattress in months. So slept in, and that was fun. Woke up the next day, went to Denny's for breakfast, and it was a pretty fun trip home.
Is it? I mean, you have a newfound appreciation for everything when you come back.
Right? Yeah, I still do. Drives my wife crazy. A good chunk of Desert Shield, we were sleeping out, and you'd have a position in the desert. Engineers would come and make a perfect square with these big dirt berms. So it would be like a football field size position, maybe, about that, maybe smaller. And we'd all dig a sleeping hole with a shovel, and we'd have cots at that point, and you just put the cot down so that if there were any bullets shooting, it would go over your head while you were sleeping. That was it. But you're exposed to the elements. There were rats, there were bugs, there were scorpions. You're not showering. A lot of the times the water you drink during the day would be hot, but you had to drink it to stay hydrated. So little things like that. A shower, brushing your teeth, It just takes a little bit of time deployed. Even if you're not deployed, the military makes you train outside in bad weather. And had I not even gone to Desert Storm, I still would appreciate being clean and being in a warm bed, being safe.
Do you remember seeing your parents and your family for the first time when you got back?
Yeah. So I got home, got to Camp Pendleton. My family obviously still in Massachusetts, and I didn't just go back to Massachusetts. There was some work we had to do, and I had used up a lot of leave right before I showed up at Camp Pendleton. You only get like 30 days leave a year, so I was kind of in the hole for leave. But someone said, "When are you going home?" I said, "I don't have much leave." Said, "Get over here. We're going to give you 2 weeks leave, Ambrose. Go." So all right, I flew home. My parents greeted me at the airport. I think I wore a uniform. I didn't have to, but I did wear one, and they gave me a big hug. And my mother said to me, "We were planning your funeral." My father's like, "Don't tell him that. Geez, what are you saying that for?" But it was, emotional for everybody. My brother and sister were there. We went out to eat, and my dad set up a party at the house in Norfolk. It was a little embarrassing, but everybody came. It was good. It was, a blip, really. It just seemed like, wow, it worked out almost too perfectly, because wars, as we saw very quickly after that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, they generally don't go that smoothly, And the circumstances of Kuwait, the Iraqis were really in exposed positions, and there was just a perfect target for our firepower to hit, destroy, and annihilate. And Saddam's forces really trying to take us on conventionally was a gross mismatch, and that's why it worked out as well as it did. When you get into urban warfare and guerrilla tactics and that sort of stuff, no matter how big and powerful you are, you're going to take casualties, which we did later on in the Iraq War, early 2000s. So I remember thinking, geez, after Desert Storm, who's going to want to screw with us? Look at what we did. There's not going to be any more wars again. But it was naive, and I was just glad we got back in one piece, and I managed to have a couple of years in California without much more angst, So
How did that change your relationship with your dad, or did it?
Yeah, definitely did. Just going into the Marines and going through Quantico, going to OCS, he was certainly more open to talking about his experiences, and I could understand what going to the rifle range was like, going to the gas chamber and practicing how to use your gas mask, or going on these hikes up and down the hills of Quantico. I went through that stuff I read about in the book, and so we were part of the same club, and it was good. I think definitely could share those experiences. And then my dad, Tom McNeil, myself, and some other Marines from the Boston area, every November at the Marine Corps birthday, we would go to this luncheon in Boston. It's a pretty big deal. And you'd sit with other Marines, and we were all part of the same kind of fraternity. It was neat. I was honored to be part of that club. I still felt like a junior varsity guy with Desert Storm compared to Vietnam, but hey, it was something. And I just happened to be in at the time when that happened, and some of my friends didn't go to Kuwait, didn't go to Desert Storm. They came in after, or their unit didn't deploy for whatever reason, and I think some of them felt bad and wished they had gone. But the military's like that. Sometimes it's a roulette wheel of sorts. Sometimes you get good deals, sometimes you get bad deals, and there's a whole myriad of experiences you can have. So I'm lucky I get in and get out of there in one piece, but it's definitely one of the most significant thing in my life, I guess, other than being a dad or being a husband. I think that 7 months in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, certainly pretty seminal moment.